The town at number 1 on this list shouldn't exist. It's a piece of old world Europe. Bell towers, ochre walls, a great pale church that has been sitting unchanged in the middle of a dry Australian paddock for nearly 180 years. And the strangest part isn't the buildings, it's that the people who built that life never left. They're still there, today, living exactly as they did in the 1840s. I'll prove that to you at the end. But it's not even the only place in this country that feels impossible. There's a bridge in Tasmania, carved by a man who was sentenced to be hanged. A fishing village of 200 people that once had 4,000 strangers camped around it in a single week. A whole town built from one stone, 10 of them, real, beautiful, and almost completely unknown. Let's go.
Number 10. Greenock, Western Australia. Let's start with a town that looks like it's bracing for a punch. Drive the highway about 24 kilometers south of Geraldton and you'll pass a line of river red gums bent flat to the ground. Not fallen, not snapped. Growing sideways, trunks pressed almost horizontal, as though the whole landscape is flinching away from something. It isn't damage, it's the wind. Salt-laden gusts off the Indian Ocean have blown so hard for so long that the trees grew at 90 degrees just to live. People stop for these trees alone. One of them has basically become the logo of the entire Midwest. But the trees are the decoy. Walk a little further and you find the real thing. Central Greenock is a hamlet of around 11 limestone buildings. A church, a courthouse, a jail, a school, a police station, standing together on a flat green floodplain with nothing modern anywhere in the frame. No power lines, no servo. The stone glows a soft honey color in late.
And the whole settlement is owned and frozen in time by the National Trust, which is the only reason it still looks like 1865. Walk the dirt between the buildings at dusk. No traffic, no voices, just the wind off the flats. And it stops feeling like a museum and starts feeling like everyone stepped out an hour ago and forgot to come back. Here's the quiet heartbreak under the postcard. Greenock was meant to last forever. Wheat farmers poured in during the 1850s and built in solid stone because they were certain they'd never leave. Then crop rust came, then floods, then drought, and one by one, they walked away. The buildings were simply too well made to fall down, so they stayed, empty, immaculate, on a plain where even the trees are trying to escape. Those gums bent themselves sideways to survive. The next town survived by doing the exact opposite. It refused to change a single board, and a famous painter made it immortal for it.
Number 9.
Sofala, New South Wales. In central New South Wales, there's a place that is more famous as a painting than as a town. In 1947, the artist Russell Drysdale drove out past Bathurst, sketched a crooked little main street of leaning timber shopfronts, and turned it into a canvas called simply Sofala. It won the Wynne Prize that year and hangs in the Art Gallery of New South Wales to this day, called one of his finest works. People who have never been within 1,000 kilometers of the place have stared at it for hours. Now the punchline. Stand on that street today and it has barely moved. Same lean in the verandas. Same dusty, uncurbed road, no gutters, no footpaths. You can step straight into the frame of a 78-year-old prize-winning painting and buy a meat pie inside it. Sofala calls itself Australia's oldest surviving gold town, and it backs it up. Gold hit the Turon River in 1851, and within a single year, the township sprawled 16 kilometers along the valley, with thousands of diggers and more than 40 hotels. Then, the easy gold thinned, the crowd vanished, and what's left is 3 or 4 streets, about 18 original Gold Rush buildings, and roughly 200 people. The Royal Hotel has poured beer since 1862. Locals still pan the river for flecks of color, 70 years after the last mine closed. It's so untouched that film crews keep using it as a ready-made set. Peter Weir shot his cult 1974 film The Cars That Ate Paris right here, and barely had to dress a single shopfront. Quick one before we keep going. Here's a game. The number 1 town, the impossible one I opened with, is in a state you would never guess. Lock in your answer in the comments now before the reveal. We'll see who got it. Sofala stopped in 1870 and never restarted. The next town has the opposite problem. It's only beautiful for about 3 weeks a year, and you can travel across the country and still miss it.
Number 8. Bright, Victoria. 100 years ago, this valley was being torn to pieces. In the high country of northeast Victoria, the Ovens Valley around Bright was a gold dredging zone. At one point, up to 42 dredges were chewing through the riverbeds, spitting out the land behind them. The town itself started as a goldfield called Morse's Creek, renamed Bright in 1861. It is not a place that was handed its beauty, it made it. Because somewhere along the way, the people here planted European trees down their avenues, scarlet oaks, elms, golden poplars, dark Himalayan cedars. And on one famous strip, the oaks and cedars were set side by side on purpose, so that every autumn the reds and greens would collide. And collide they do. For a few weeks each year, the whole town detonates into burning red and orange and gold, threaded with deep evergreen. They've held a festival to celebrate it since 1962. It looks nothing like Australia. It looks like New England, or the Alps, dropped into a gully below the snowfields. So striking that paragliders launch off the surrounding peaks just to drift over the colour. And here is the cruel, brilliant catch. Nobody can tell you the exact week the colour peaks. One hot snap, one windy night, and the leaves are on the ground before the crowds arrive. You can book a trip to Bright specifically for the most beautiful thing it does, and find the trees went bare last Tuesday. A town of 2,600 that balloons toward 20,000 people chasing a window that may have already closed. A valley that was gouged open for gold, replanted by hand into one of the prettiest streets in the country, for 3 weeks if you're lucky. So far, these towns have been pretty. The next one comes with one of the most extraordinary human stories in Australian history bolted onto it.
Number 7. Robe, South Australia. Picture a quiet limestone fishing town of 200 people. Now picture 4,000 strangers camped in and around it in a single week. That happened to Robe. In 1857, ship captains found a loophole. The colony of Victoria had slapped a £10 tax on every Chinese passenger landing at its ports, more than the cost of the entire voyage from China, purely to keep Chinese gold seekers out. So the captain stopped just short of the border and offloaded them at Robe in South Australia instead. From here, somewhere between 16 and 17,000 Chinese men walked roughly 400 kilometers overland to the Victorian goldfields, digging wells along the route for the ones coming behind them. At the peak, 1 week saw over 4,000 of them camped around a town built for a couple of hundred. They flew kites, dried seaweed for the trek, and walked. It is one of the most remarkable and least told chapters in this country's story, and it happened on a beach most Australians can't find on a map. That's the history. The beauty is the stone. Robe was one of South Australia's earliest ports, set up in 1846, and almost everything, the old customs house, the cottages, the obelisk standing alone on the point, was cut from local limestone, cream and gold in warm light, bleaching white at midday. No high-rises, no chains gutting the main street. Lake Butler sits glassy and sheltered in the middle of town, while the Southern Ocean throws itself at the cliffs just past it. On a clear evening, the sun drops straight into the water at the end of the main beach, and the limestone shifts from gold to rose to grey as the light goes. About 1,300 people live here now, holding a coastline that, if it sat anywhere near a capital city, would cost a fortune per metre. Robe survived by staying small.
Number 6. Sheffield, Tasmania. This is the story of a town that was quietly dying, so it painted its way out. Sheffield sits in northern Tasmania at the foot of Mount Roland, a 1,200 metre wall of rock that fills the sky behind every street. For most of last century, it ran on dairy and on the army of workers building the region's huge hydroelectric scheme. Then the hydro construction finished, the workers moved on, and the town began to hollow out the way hundreds of rural towns quietly do. Shops shutting, young people leaving, nothing coming the other way. In the mid-1980s, a few locals heard about a town in Canada called Chemainus that had saved itself by covering its walls in murals. They tried the same desperate idea. The first mural went up in December 1986, then another, then dozens. Huge photoreal paintings of pioneers, bushrangers, mountain scenes, the area's whole history splashed across nearly every blank wall in town. It worked almost absurdly well.
Sheffield is now known nationally as the town of murals. There are well over 60 of them, and the place pulls something like 200,000 visitors a year into a town of 1,600. There's an annual competition where a poem is chosen and artists from around the world paint their reading of it. A town that ran out of money turned its own buildings into a free open-air gallery under one of the most dramatic mountain backdrops in Tasmania, on the doorstep of the road to Cradle Mountain. It's beautiful, and it's beautiful on purpose, which is rarer than it sounds. Quick break. If a town painting itself back to life is your kind of story, subscribe. We dig up the Australia the glossy travel ads have never found. Or don't and keep scrolling past the same opera house shot for the rest of your life. Genuinely your call. Sheffield fought to stay alive. The next town lost that fight completely. And that is exactly what makes it beautiful.
Number 5. Cossack, Western Australia.
By 1950, everyone had gone. The doors were left to swing, and the town just waited. Cossack sits at the mouth of the Harding River in the Pilbara, more than 1,400 kilometers north of Perth. Today, it's a near-perfect ghost town, and the emptiness is the entire point. A handful of squat bluestone buildings, a courthouse, a customs house, a post and telegraph office, a bakehouse, stand restored and gleaming against red dirt and turquoise water, with nobody living in any of them. One caretaker keeps it tidy. That's the population. The cyclones still come through most summers, the salt air still works at the mortar, and the desert is taking the place back one grain at a time, slowly enough that, for now, it looks less abandoned than simply paused. It wasn't always this still. Settled in 1863 and first called Tien Sin, Cossack was the birthplace of Western Australia's pearling industry and the first real port in the state's northwest.
In the early 1870s, up to 80 pearling luggers worked out of here.
Then, a cyclone tore through in 1898. The pearling fleet drifted north to Broome. The bigger ships outgrew the little harbour, and by the 1950s, Cossack was surrendered to the heat and the salt. Long before any of that, and still, this is Narluma country, known as Bajan-Herba, a place of meaning for tens of thousands of years, and the town site is now cared for by the Narluma and Yinjibarndi Foundation. Stand on the beach on the right night and you can watch the staircase to the moon, moonlight laddering across the exposed mudflats. A stone town built for thousands, kept spotless, lived in by no one. It's the most peaceful kind of beautiful, and the most haunting. That ghost town was emptied by economics. The next place was built by a man who was supposed to be hanged.
Number 4. Ross, Tasmania.
In 1827, a highwayman named Daniel Herbert was sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to transportation to Van Diemen's Land for life. And that single act of mercy is the reason one of the most beautiful objects in Australia exists. Because Herbert was a stonemason, a brilliant one, and in the Tasmanian Midlands town of Ross, he was put to work, alongside fellow convict James Colbeck, building a sandstone bridge across the Macquarie River. He could have laid plain blocks. Instead, over about 56 weeks, he carved it. The Ross Bridge, finished in 1836 and the third oldest bridge still in use in the country, is covered in 186 individual carvings across its 6 arches, Celtic symbols, plants, animals, the faces of local figures, and on one keystone, a lion devouring a lamb, which more than one historian reads as a quiet convict jab at imperial cruelty. Nobody is sure who signed off on this riot of sculpture on a plain government bridge.
It was so good that Herbert was granted his freedom for it.
Once pardoned, he settled in Ross, lived out his life there and, so the story goes, carved his own headstone. The town around the bridge is the rest of the prize. Ross is one of Tasmania's finest heritage villages, a tight run of Georgian sandstone shopfronts and old elm trees, bypassed by the highway in the 1990s, so the coaches mostly sail straight past. About 400 people. The bakery has run for over a century on its original wood-fired oven. Quiet, golden, almost untouched. A whole town orbiting a bridge that a condemned man turned into art. Ross is beautiful because of what one human hand made. The next town was made by the earth, about 12 million years before any human hand arrived.
Number 3. Stanley, Tasmania.
Now picture a fishing village living in the literal shadow of a volcano. On Tasmania's wild northwest coast, the town of Stanley huddles at the base of a single staggering object the locals call the Nut, a flat-topped plug of dark basalt that rears 143 meters straight out of Bass Strait. It's the solidified core of an extinct volcano, around 12 million years old, that the softer rock around it has long since worn away. From a distance, it looks like a giant set a table in the sea and walked off. The Ptomagan people knew it as Mu Not Recair long before any ship arrived. You can hike the steep zigzag track up, or, far better, ride an open chairlift up the side and walk the loop around the top, the whole coastline unrolling beneath you. If you've ever driven Tasmania's north coast, you may have seen the Nut on the horizon and never realised there was a perfectly preserved colonial town tucked at its foot. There is. Narrow streets, stone cottages, the grand old Highfield homestead watching from the hill, founded in the 1820s as the base for the Van Diemen's Land Company. At dusk, little penguins waddle ashore at Godfrey's Beach, free for anyone to sit and watch. In summer, boats run out to a seal colony just offshore. And in one of those cottages, in 1879, was born Joseph Lyons, to this day the only Tasmanian ever to become Prime Minister of Australia. The light here works the basalt like a mood ring, dark in the morning shadow, gold by afternoon, black against a pink sky after sunset. A heritage village, a penguin colony, a Prime Minister's birthplace, and a 12 million year old volcano stacked into a town of under 500. The Nut was carved by fire and time. The next town was carved out of one quarry, and it might be the most cinematic place on this list.
Number 2. Mintaro, South Australia.
If you've ever seen Picnic at Hanging Rock, the dreamlike, faintly sinister 1975 classic about schoolgirls who simply vanish, you've already glimpsed the edge of this town without knowing it. The grand house that plays the doomed Appleyard College in that film is Martindale Hall, a 32-room Georgian mansion standing, improbably, on the edge of a tiny village in the Clare Valley. And here's the detail that gives people chills. Older Mintaro residents reportedly used to call that mansion the House of Sorrow for the number of deaths inside its walls. The village itself, Mintaro, is the real marvel. Fewer than 100 people live here, among buildings around 170 years old, made almost entirely from one material, slate, the blue-grey stone lying directly beneath the valley. Mintaro was founded in 1849 as a rest stop on the road hauling copper ore down from the Burra mine. Bullock teams pulling up for the night, the iron rings they were, tied to still set into the stone. The masons who built it, many from Cornwall and Wales, used the local slate for everything: walls, roofs, paths, fences. The result looks like a transplanted corner of Britain that somehow grew straight out of the South Australian dirt, and that slate is famous for a reason. The Mintaro quarry is the oldest continuously working slate quarry in the country, cutting some of the hardest slate on Earth, hard enough and big enough to make a full billiard table top in a single piece, with no joins, which almost nowhere else in the world can do. The whole village is classified by the National Trust, locked in perpetuity. Walk it on a weekday morning when the visitors are gone and the locals are indoors, and the sound of your own footsteps on the slate is the loudest thing for streets in every direction. A silent, single-stone village with a haunted mansion on its shoulder. Which brings us to the one I promised you at the very start.
Number 1. New Norsa, Western Australia.
Drive 132 kilometers north of Perth through flat, dry wheat belt where you expect a grain silo and a pub and not much else. And then the road hands you a hallucination. A town of soaring Spanish and Byzantine buildings, ochre walls, bell towers, a great pale church rising out of the bush beside a river. It looks like a corner of Andalusia that got lost and ended up in a paddock. This is New Norsa. It is the only monastic town in Australia. It was founded in 1847 by Spanish Benedictine monks, led by a remarkable figure named Rosendo Salvado. In the honest telling, it began as a mission, built to educate and convert Aboriginal children, with all the hard colonial history that carries.
Over the generations, it grew into something singular, a working monastery, a set of grand colleges, a hotel, a chapel, an art collection, a farm. The architecture, much of it shaped by a later abbot, is genuinely European. Facades and arches you'd cross the world to see in southern Spain, sitting here behind a fence in the wheat belt. And here is why it tops the list. The monks never left. A community that once numbered around 70 has shrunk to a small handful, roughly a dozen men today. But they are still here, still living by the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. Still rising before dawn to pray, still working the land, baking bread, pressing olive oil, exactly as their predecessors did for nearly 180 years. You can stay overnight in the old colleges. You can take the tour. You can buy the bread and the famous nut cake, baked this morning. There's even an old observatory in the grounds, a relic of monks who once charted the southern sky. It is the most improbable, beautiful place in this country. A living fragment of monastic Europe, unchanged, still breathing, in the middle of a field almost nobody has heard of. Everything else on this list is a town that survived. New Norcia is a town that simply, quietly, refused to end. So, did you guess the state? Drop it in the comments. 10 towns, 10 kinds of beautiful, not one of them needing a passport or a queue. Tell me which one you're driving to first.